Women are the backbone of the development of rural and national economies. They comprise 43% of the world's agricultural labor force, which rises to 70% in some countries. Of those women in the least developed countries who report being economically active, 79% report agriculture as their primary source of livelihood. 48% of economically active women worldwide. According to Food and Agricultural Organization's latest estimates, 925 million people are currently undernourished. Closing the gender gap in agricultural yields could bring that number down by as much as 100 to 150 million people. Many studies show that yields on plots managed by women are lower than those managed by men. This is not because women are worse farmers than men. Indeed, extensive evidence shows that women are just as efficient as men. They simply do not have access to the same inputs. Women don't have the same access to seeds, credit, technology, and extension services. If they did, their yields would be the same as men's. They would produce more and overall agricultural production would increase.
One area that has been talked about continuously, looking at all the nightingales now, is that of inclusion. I think over the years, the stakeholders globally have come to realize that inequality will forever remain like a hindering factor to a lot of developmental issues. So now when you're talking about achieving maternal and child security, food security, water and sanitation security, all these things can come to play when there is equality. In a situation where there is no equality, where some people have access compared to the others, where some people feel a sense of belonging compared to the others, there definitely will always be problems. So you can see that it's obvious that the world bodies have come to understand this, and that has shown in the way it is with the Sustainable Development Goals. There has been a lot of equity, making sure that the main goal is leaving no one behind. Obviously, by the time nobody is left behind, definitely would, by 2030, we'll be able to now think of it and say, yes, I think we've been able to achieve development, and this development has been sustainable.
Nigeria is set to become the fourth most populous country in the world by 2050. Agriculture plays an important role in its economy, contributing approximately 40% of its GDP and engaging about 60% of the workforce. It plays an even larger role in the north of the country, employing 80% of households compared with approximately 50% in the more urban, oil-producing south. Yet the sector remains mostly small-scale and subsistence-based, with relatively low levels of commercialization. Nearly half Nigerians live below the national poverty line, and those in the agricultural sector face even higher poverty levels. Numerous factors constrain women's contribution to agricultural growth. As in most of sub-Saharan Africa, women in Nigeria have relatively limited access to productive agricultural land, inputs and services compared with men. Reducing the gender gap in agricultural productivity stands to substantially reduce poverty in the country. The vital role of women and the need for their full and equal participation and leadership in all areas of sustainable development cannot be overemphasized. But for the SDGs to be achieved, everyone must play their role effectively.
Goal 17 talks about building partnerships. Of course, in a national setting, the government takes the lead. The government, like in Nigeria's situation, the federal government, and then the state government, and even at local government, they will take the lead. But the private sector has a role to play, civil society has a role to play, the religious institutions have a role to play, youth and women have roles to play, and the media has a role to play. While the government takes the lead, because the government really has most of the resources that you need to implement development activities. But we need all actors to be involved. That's why we have that goal 17. In fact, not only the local, the national actors, even international actors, those who support development work in Nigeria should align now themselves with these sustainable development goals.
It has been shown that if women farmers used the same level of resources as men on the land they farm, they would achieve the same yield levels. The yield gap between men and women averages around 20 to 30%, and most research finds that the gap is due to differences in resource use. Bringing yields on the land farmed by women up to the levels achieved by men would increase agricultural output in developing countries between 2.5 and 4%. Women in sub-Saharan Africa have relatively high overall labor force participation rates and the highest average agricultural land force participation rates in the world. Increasing production by this amount could reduce the number of undernourished people in the world in the order of 12 to 17%. For the smallholder farmer in Africa, escaping poverty is made doubly hard by the fact that climate change makes water less available, land more arid, and weather more unpredictable.
Why we have not been able to achieve so much in MDG, especially in developing countries like Africa. And part of it has to do more with governance, with the issue of poverty, with the issue of economic policy, with the issue of what we call development process. And then along the line, we have also have to fight what we call climate change. I've always described climate change as the greatest threat to human life in this century.
Not only in Nigeria, in many parts of the world, access to resources is a major cause of conflict. There are people fighting over land. I don't have enough land, or somebody has taken my land, and that can be a conflict, even inter-country conflict. There are people fighting over water, access to water. One of the problems we have in the broader eastern part of Africa is where the UN actually is intervening in Darfur. In Darfur, Sudan, one of the causes of the conflict that has been going on, there are other factors, but it's partly access to resources and mainly water. So how we manage our resources is very, very important. And this is not new to Nigeria. How you manage resources in many parts of the country has been a cause of some conflicts. And yes, I agree, this is something that the country has to take very seriously. And I hope with the focus that we have now, very clear and targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, which actually the government of Nigeria has adopted.
Experts say to fully achieve the first Sustainable Development Goal of ending poverty, women's rights to equal access to social protection safety nets and use of latest technology in agriculture must be ensured.
Taking the lead, to me, is one thing. Active participation by all of us is another. Because one of the things that SDG is raising is that we want to sort out the problem of poverty by 2030.
The agricultural landscape impacts of climate change linked to gender inequality become particularly prominent when few alternative forms of employment and livelihood exist. The gender gap in agriculture, a pattern documented worldwide, and one which means women have less access to productive resources, financial capital and advisory services than men, will be disproportionately exacerbated by climate change. This is particularly relevant in the context of the development of climate-smart agriculture programs. The latest report by the International Panel on Climate Change highlights vulnerability to climate change and to the impact of some mitigation and adaptation responses due to gender and other factors, including class, ethnicity, and age. A recent study by the Rio Plus 20 Center and the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, which looks at the complex relationship between gender and climate-smart agriculture, emphasizes the need for both gender smartness and people smartness in achieving the climate-smart agriculture's aims of food security, higher farmer incomes, and low-carbon agricultural practices.